The wind in the Hinterlands didn't just blow, it bit. It chewed through wool and leather, seeking the warmth of blood beneath. Eira lowered her head against the gale, clutching her bundle of damp firewood like a lifeline. She was 3 miles from her cabin, standing on the edge of Mirror Lake. The vast expanse of ice stretched out before her, a desolate sheet of white under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. It was silent here, a heavy, oppressive silence that usually signaled a storm or death. Eira stepped onto the ice. She shouldn't be here. The currents beneath were treacherous in late winter. But the shortcut would save her an hour, and her fingers were already going numb inside her mittens. Crack. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. Eira froze, her heart hammering a sudden, frantic rhythm against her ribs. Then came the splash. 50 yards out, the pristine white surface had been shattered. Black water churned violently in a jagged hole. Something had fallen through. Eira hesitated. In these woods, curiosity killed faster than the cold. It could be a trap. It could be a beast. But then a sound drifted across the ice, a low, desperate whine that clawed at her chest. It wasn't the sound of a monster. It was the sound of a living thing terrified of dying alone. Dropping her wood, she ran. She moved light and fast, distributing her weight as her father had taught her before the pox took him. As she neared the hole, she dropped to her stomach, sliding the last few feet. The cold seeped through her coat instantly, stealing her breath. She peered over the jagged edge. Staring back at her were eyes the color of molten gold. Eira gasped, recoiling. It was a wolf. But not a normal wolf. This creature was massive, its head broad and regal, its fur as black as midnight. A shifter. The enemy. The monsters that the village elders warned about in hushed, fearful tones. He was thrashing, his massive paws scrabbling uselessly against the slick ice. The weight of his waterlogged fur was dragging him down. He was drowning. "Let him die," a voice whispered in her head. "He is a predator, a killer." The wolf's head went under. He surfaced a second later, choking. His golden eyes locking onto hers with a piercing intelligence. There was no aggression there, only fear. And a plea so human it made her stomach turn. Eira cursed under her breath. "You stupid, stupid girl!" She ripped the thick woolen scarf from her neck. "Grab it!" she screamed, the wind tearing the words from her mouth. She lashed the scarf out. The end landed in the water near his snout. The wolf snapped his jaws, catching the wool. Eira gripped the other end with both hands, digging her boots into the ice. "Pull!" she gritted out, straining. It was like trying to anchor a ship. He was impossibly heavy. The muscles in her arms screamed, burning with lactic acid. She slipped, her chest hitting the ice, sliding toward the black water. The wolf scrambled. Sensing her effort, he found a surge of desperate strength. His claws gouged deep grooves into the ice, finding purchase. With a final, agonizing heave, Eira pulled back. The wolf surged forward. He collapsed onto the solid ice beside her, a mountain of wet, black fur. Eira rolled onto her back, gasping for air, black spots dancing in her vision. The cold was already stiffening her clothes, freezing the water that had splashed onto her. For a moment, only the sound of their ragged breathing filled the air. Then, the wolf moved. Eira scrambled backward, her hand fumbling for the small knife at her belt. "Stay back," she warned, her voice trembling. The beast didn't attack. He tried to stand, his massive paws slipping, but his back legs gave out. He collapsed with a groan that vibrated in the ice beneath them. That was when she saw the blood. It wasn't just water pooling around him. A dark crimson stain was spreading from his flank, melting the snow. Eira's healer instincts overrode her fear. She crawled closer, her eyes scanning his form. He was shivering violently. Hypothermia, yes, but shifters ran hot. They shouldn't freeze this fast. She reached out, her hand hovering over his flank. The wolf growled. A low rumble deep in his chest, but he was too weak to stop her. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Let me see." She pushed aside the matted, wet fur. Eira hissed through her teeth. Buried deep in the thick muscle of his thigh was an arrow. The shaft was black wood, fletched with crow feathers. But the smell coming from the wound was what terrified her. The scent of burning flesh and sickness. "Iron," she breathed. A hunter's arrow. Iron was poison to shifters. It stopped their unnatural healing, festered in their blood, and killed them slowly and painfully. He hadn't just fallen through the ice. He had been hunted, chased, shot, and driven into the frozen lake to die. She looked up at his face. The wolf was watching her, his golden eyes glazing over with pain. But beneath the pain, she felt it again. That strange, inexplicable pull. It was like standing too close to a fire. A heat that radiated from him and settled under her skin. He blinked, his eyelids heavy. He was dying. If she left him, he would be dead within the hour. If she helped him, if she was caught harboring a shifter, the village council would hang her without a trial. Eira looked at the desolate horizon. The snow was beginning to fall. Thick, heavy flakes that would cover their tracks. "Damn you," she whispered, tears of frustration pricking her eyes. "Damn you for finding me." She couldn't leave him. She was an outcast, a healer of broken things. She couldn't walk away from suffering, even if it wore the face of a monster. She grabbed the scruff of his neck, her fingers burying in the thick mane. "Listen to me," she said, leaning close to his ear. He smelled of wet dog, metallic blood, and something else. Pine and ozone, the scent of a storm about to break. "I have a sled near the tree line. I'm going to drag you. If you bite me, I'll leave you here to rot. Do you understand?" The wolf let out a soft huff, his head lolling onto her knee. It was surrender. Eira looked around one last time. The white emptiness stared back. She was alone with the beast. She began to pull. She didn't know his name. She didn't know he was a king. She didn't know that by saving his life, she had just ended her own as she knew it. The trek back was a blur of white agony. Eira didn't remember dragging the sled through the door. She only remembered the relief of the latch clicking shut against the wind. She collapsed on the rug, her lungs burning. The massive wolf sprawled beside her like a fallen monument. The cabin was freezing, but the heat radiating from his body was already warming the air, smelling of wet fur and iron. Eira forced herself up. "Don't you dare die!" she hissed, her hands shaking as she stoked the fire into a roar. She turned back to him. The blood was spreading faster now. The iron arrow in his flank was a death sentence ticking down. She gathered her supplies. a basin of snow-melt water, clean linen, and her skinning knife. She held the blade in the flames until the metal glowed an angry red. There was no time for gentleness. She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his heaving ribs. "This will hurt." She gripped the arrow shaft. With a grunt of effort, she ripped it free. The wolf didn't just growl. He screamed, a raw, terrifying sound that shook the jars on her shelves. Eira didn't flinch. She immediately pressed the red-hot knife to the wound. The stench of singed fur and cauterized flesh filled the room. The beast thrashed once, wildly, and then went limp. "Done," Eira breathed, tossing the knife into the water basin with a hiss. "It's done." She reached for a rag to clean the blood from his coat. Crack. The sound was wet and loud, like a tree snapping in a storm. Eira froze. Snap. Grind. The wolf's body arched off the floor. His bones were moving under the skin, reshaping, lengthening. The black fur receded like a retreating tide, revealing flushed, feverish skin beneath. Eira scrambled backward, her back hitting the leg of her table. She watched in horrified fascination as the snout retracted, the paws elongated into hands, and the beast dissolved. In his place lay a man. He was unclothed and devastating. He was huge, broader than any man in the village, his body a map of hard muscle and white scars. His hair was as black as the wolf's pelt, matted with sweat against a forehead burning with fever. He wasn't just a man. He was a weapon carved from winter itself. Eira's breath caught. She should look away, cover him, run. But she was paralyzed by the sheer, raw power radiating off him. He groaned, his head lolling to the side. Eira swallowed hard. She grabbed a quilt and crept forward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached out to cover him. Her fingers grazed his shoulder. His eyes snapped open. In a blur of motion, his hand shot up and locked around her throat. Eira gasped as he yanked her down. The world spun. Suddenly, she was pinned to the rough floorboards, the crushing weight of him pressing the air from her lungs. He hovered over her, caging her between his arms, his skin seared against hers, unnaturally hot. "Assassin!" he snarled. His voice was a ruin, deep, gravelly, and lethal. His lips pulled back to reveal teeth that still looked too sharp. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They were molten gold, glowing in the firelight, wild with pain and instinct. "No!" Eira choked out, clawing uselessly at the thick wrist holding her. "I saved you!" He didn't hear her. He was lost in the fever, seeing enemies in the shadows. His grip tightened just enough to warn. He lowered his head, his face inches from hers. Eira squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bite. Instead, he inhaled. He pressed his nose to the pulse frantically beating in her neck. He took a deep, shuddering breath, smelling her fear, her blood, her scent. The growl in his chest rumbled again, but the pitch changed. The violence bled out, replaced by a dark, heavy confusion. "Winter," he rasped, his nose brushing her jawline. "You smell like sanctuary." He froze. The gold in his eyes swirled, the pupils blowing wide as they locked onto hers. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Mine?" The word was barely a whisper, but it landed with the weight of a decree. Eira trembled beneath him. The heat of his body was seeping into hers, melting the cold from her bones. A treacherous spark of attraction flared in her belly, terrified and undeniable. The effort drained him. His eyes rolled back. "Don't leave," he slurred. His arms gave out. He collapsed heavily on top of her, his face burying in the crook of her neck, his dead weight pinning her completely to the rug. Eira lay still in the silence of the cabin, staring up at the firelight dancing on the beams. She was trapped beneath a naked king who had just claimed her, however deliriously. She tried to push him off, but he was immovable, and as he drifted into deep sleep, his arm instinctively tightened around her waist, anchoring her to him. Outside, the storm finally broke. Inside, Eira knew the real storm had just begun. Eira woke to the sensation of being crushed by a furnace. Sunlight was streaming through the cracks in the shutters, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cold air. But she wasn't cold. She was sweltering. The man was still on top of her. His heavy arm was thrown across her waist, clamping her to his side like a favored pillow. His face was buried in the curve of her neck, his breath slow and rhythmic against her skin. Every exhale sent a shiver of goosebumps down her spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a treacherous, biological thrill. She lay there for a moment, paralyzed by the intimacy of it. He smelled of wood smoke, dried blood, and deep, masculine musk. It was a scent that made her head spin. "Move," she commanded herself, "before the beast wakes up." She carefully peeled his arm away. It was heavy, the muscle dense and relaxed in sleep. She slid out from under him inch by inch, holding her breath. When she finally stood up, her legs wobbled. She looked down at him. In the daylight, he was even more imposing. The quilt had slipped, revealing the expanse of his back and the curve of his hip. The angry red of the cauterized wound on his thigh stood out against the pale skin. But Eira leaned closer. The edges were already knitting together. "Impossible," she whispered. Even for a shifter, that was fast. She grabbed the quilt and pulled it up to his shoulders, covering him completely. Her fingers lingered for a second too long on the rough wool, sensing the heat radiating off him. She turned away, her heart racing, and moved to the hearth to revive the fire. She needed to boil water. She needed a weapon closer to hand. She was reaching for the iron poker when the air in the room changed. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure. The hair on the back of her arm stood up. Eira froze, gripping the cold iron of the poker. She turned around slowly. He was awake. He hadn't moved a muscle, but his eyes were open. The golden haze of the fever was gone, replaced by a clarity that was sharp and cold as a winter blade. He was watching her with the stillness of a predator deciding which artery to sever. "Where am I?" His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse, but it held an unmistakable note of command. It wasn't a question, it was a demand. "My cabin," Eira said, keeping her voice steady. She held the poker loosely at her side, not quite a threat, but a promise. "Near the edge of the blind woods." His gaze flicked around the small, impoverished room, the drying herbs hanging from the rafters, the single table, the worn rug. His lip curled slightly. "You're a witch?" "I'm a healer," she corrected sharply. "And you're welcome, by the way." He shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his leg. He looked down, lifting the quilt to inspect the bandage. His expression remained hard, unreadable. You removed the iron. I did, and I dragged you off the ice before you froze to death. He looked back at her. The intensity of his gaze was physical. He was assessing her size, her strength, her fear. Why? Because I'm stupid, Eira snapped, her nerves fraying under his scrutiny. And I don't like watching things die. He sat up. The quilt pooled at his waist, leaving his chest bare. Eira tried to keep her eyes on his face, but the sheer expanse of him was distracting. A tattoo of a black sun covered his left pectoral, the ink stark against his skin, the mark of the royal house. Eira's breath hitched. She took a step back, her knuckles turning white on the poker. You're not just a alpha. He didn't deny it. He swung his legs off the rug, planting his feet on the floor. My clothes. Ruined. I had to cut them off. He let out a frustrated growl, running a hand through his tangled black hair. I need to leave. You can't walk, Eira pointed out. The iron poison is still in your blood. If you try to shift or run, your heart will stop. He ignored her. He gripped the edge of the table and hauled himself up. He stood to his full height, and Eira felt very, very small. He towered over her, easily 6'5", a wall of muscle and dominance. The room suddenly felt claustrophobic. He took one step. His leg buckled. Damn it! He pitched forward. Eira moved before she thought. She dropped the poker and lunged, catching him around the waist. It was a mistake. His weight slammed into her, driving the breath from her lungs. But she held him up. Her arms wrapped around his bare torso, her hands splayed against the hot, hard skin of his back. His arm came around her shoulders to steady himself. They were pressed together, chest to chest, hip to hip. The reaction was explosive. The moment their skin touched, a shockwave went through Eira, hot and electric. It wasn't just heat. It was a feeling of rightness, like a key sliding into a lock. He stiffened, his breath hitching. He felt it too. He looked down at her. His face was inches away. The gold in his eyes flared, swallowing the pupil, glowing with a terrifying, hungry light. He didn't push her away. Instead, his hand tightened on her shoulder, his fingers digging in, pulling her closer into his gravity. Who are you? He whispered, and this time the command was gone. There was only awe. And the same confusion from the night before. Eira looked up, trapped in his gaze, unable to look away. Her heart hammered against his ribs, and she knew he could feel it. Eira, she breathed. Eira. He tested the name, his voice dropping to a velvety growl that vibrated through her bones. Snow. He leaned in, his head lowered, his gaze dropping to her lips. The air between them crackled, heavy and thick with unspent tension. He was going to kiss her, or bite her. She wasn't sure which one she wanted more. Then a sound cut through the moment. Thump, thump, thump. Heavy boots on the porch outside. Then a fist pounded on the door. Open up! By order of the sheriff! The alpha went rigid in her arms. The tenderness vanished instantly, replaced by lethal tension. He bared his teeth at the door, a low snarl rising in his throat. Eira's blood went cold. The sheriff. If they found a shifter here, a royal shifter, they wouldn't just kill him. They would burn the cabin down with her inside. The knock on the door sounded like a gunshot. Kaelen snarled, a vibration that transferred directly into Eira's chest where they were pressed together. It was a sound of pure violence. Stop, Eira hissed, gripping his bare arms. You can't fight, not like this. I don't hide, he growled, his golden eyes fixing on the door. You do today, she whispered fiercely. That's Sheriff Duncan. If he sees you, a king, he won't arrest you. He'll skin you, and then he'll hang me." The reality of her danger cut through his haze. He looked at her, seeing the terror in her eyes. It wasn't fear of him. It was fear for him. "Where?" he demanded. Eira grabbed his arm, steering him toward the hearth. She kicked the rug aside, revealing the iron ring of a trapdoor. She yanked it open. A draft of damp, earthy air rose up. "Root cellar," she breathed. "Get in." Kaelen looked into the dark hole with disdain, but another heavy pound on the door decided for him. He slid into the darkness. "If he touches you," Kaelen whispered, his eyes burning from the shadows, "I will tear this cabin apart." Eira slammed the trapdoor and kicked the rug back over it. She smoothed her hair, grabbed a shawl to cover her shaking hands, and opened the door just a crack. Sheriff Duncan stood there, a wall of bulky wool and bad intentions. He smelled of stale ale and grease. "Sheriff," Eira said, blocking the gap. "We found tracks," Duncan rasped, his eyes darting over her shoulder. "On the lake." "Someone went through the ice." "A deer," Eira lied smoothly. "It drowned before I could get to it." Duncan pushed the door. It wasn't violent, just a heavy, presumptuous lean that forced Eira back. He stepped inside, stamping snow onto her floor. "Big deer," he muttered, crouching to touch the wet spot on the rug where Kaelen had lain. He sniffed his fingers. "Blood." Eira's heart hammered. "I butchered a rabbit." Duncan stood slowly, invading her space. "It smells like wolf in here. Wet dog." "Furs," she said, pointing to the drying pelts. "The damp brings out the smell." Duncan stared at her. The silence was suffocating. He took a step closer, backing her against the table. He reached out, his rough thumb grazing her cheek. Beneath the floorboards, Eira felt a vibration, a low hum. Kaelen could hear this. "It's dangerous alone, Eira," Duncan murmured, his eyes dropping to her mouth. "A woman needs protection, especially with beasts roaming." Eira forced herself not to flinch. "I have my knife." "Search the perimeter," a voice shouted outside. Duncan pulled back, annoyed. He gave her a lingering, slimy look. "Keep your door locked. If you see anything unusual, you come to me." He marched out. Eira waited until his footsteps faded. Then she bolted the door and ripped the rug back. Kaelen exploded from the cellar before she could offer a hand. He was shaking with adrenaline, his face twisted in fury. He grabbed Eira, his large hands clamping onto her shoulders. "Did he hurt you?" he snarled. "I'm fine," she gasped. "He touched your face," Kaelen accused. "I should have ripped his throat out." "And then we'd both be dead?" Eira snapped. Kaelen stared at her, his chest heaving, fighting the instinct to kill. Suddenly, his legs gave out. The adrenaline crash hit him hard. He stumbled. Eira caught him, guiding him back to the furs. He sank down, pale and sweating. She knelt to check his bandage. Fresh blood had seeped through. "Why is the sheriff hunting you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's a bully, not a king's hunter." Kaelen looked at the ceiling. "He isn't hunting me. He's hunting for Torvin." Eira froze. Torvin, the usurper, the rogue alpha exiled years ago. "The arrow wasn't a poacher's arrow," Kaelen revealed grimly. "It was an assassin's. Torvin has returned, and he has bought your sheriff." Eira sat back, the horror sinking in. She was in the middle of a coup. "You need to leave," Kaelen said, his voice rough. He reached out, his burning hand covering hers. "Pack a bag. Go south. Leave me." Eira looked at his hand, so large, so scarred, covering hers. She looked at the door, where the wind was now howling like a banshee. "No," she said. "I am ordering you." "You are a patient," she countered, dipping a cloth in cool water and pressing it to his chest. "And I don't abandon patience." He hissed at the contact, but leaned into her touch. A low rumble built in his chest, a purr of comfort he couldn't suppress. "Besides," she whispered, looking at the frosted window, "the storm has broken. We're snowed in. No one leaves tonight." Kaelen opened his eyes. The gold was dark with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Then God help us both," he murmured. The storm outside erased the world. There was no forest, no lake, no sheriff. There was only the wind screaming against the logs and the suffocating heat inside the cabin. Hours had passed. Kaelen sat propped against the wall by the hearth. The furs pooled at his waist. The fever had broken, leaving him lucid but exhausted. He hadn't taken his eyes off Eira. She moved around the small space, tidying jars that didn't need tidying, acutely aware of his gaze. It felt like a physical weight dragging along her spine. "Stop moving," Kaelen rumbled. Eira froze, a dried bundle of sage in her hand. "I'm working." "You're pacing. You smell like anxiety." "And you smell like trouble," she shot back, turning to face him. "So we're even." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, sharp, dangerous, and devastatingly handsome. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Come here." "No." "Eira." His voice dropped, vibrating through the floorboards. "I need to check the wound. I can't reach it." It was a lie. They both knew it. He was an alpha. He could reach his own leg. But Eira set the sage down and walked to him anyway. She knelt on the rug, the firelight casting their shadows long against the wall. She reached for the bandage on his thigh. His skin was scorching hot, the muscles of his quadriceps jumping slightly under her touch. "It's healing," she murmured, avoiding his eyes. "The edges are sealing." "Not that wound," Kaelen said softly. Eira looked up. He was watching her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. He reached out, his large hand cupping her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, rough skin against soft. "Why didn't you run when Duncan came?" he asked. "You could have given me up. You would be a hero." "I told you," Eira whispered, her heart pounding against his hand. "I don't like death." "Liar." He leaned closer, his golden eyes searching hers. "You feel it too. The pull. The gravity." Eira pulled back, scrambling to her feet. "I don't know what you're talking about. It's the fever. It's the magic." "It's not magic," Kaelen growled, frustration leaking into his tone. He tried to stand, ignoring the pain, fueled by the instinct to chase. "It's biology, Eira. It's fate." He rose to his full height, filling the room again. He took a step toward her. Eira backed up until she hit the table. Stay back, she warned, though her voice lacked conviction. I can't. He closed the distance in 2 strides. He didn't grab her. He just planted his hands on the table on either side of her hips, caging her in. He leaned down, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. You smell like snow and wild honey, he groaned, his body shuddering against hers. It's driving me mad. Eira's hands came up to push him away, but they landed on his bare chest and stayed there. Her fingers curled into the hard muscle. The heat of him was intoxicating. Kaelen, she breathed. You're confused. You're the king. I'm just... You are the only thing keeping me anchored to this earth, he interrupted, lifting his head to look at her. His pupils were blown wide, eclipsing the gold. Do you understand? My wolf. He wants to claim you, right now, on this floor. The raw honesty of it shocked her. The air between them crackled, heavy with unspent desire. But I won't, he said, his voice straining with effort. He pulled back an inch, his jaw clenched tight. Because if I start, I won't be able to stop, and I won't take you like a beast in a storm. He pushed himself off the table, stumbling back toward the fire, putting distance between them as if her touch burned him. Go to sleep, Eira, he commanded harshly, turning his back to her. Go to your bed. Lock the door to your room if you have one. Why? He looked over his shoulder. His eyes were glowing in the dark, inhuman and terrified. Because the poison weakened my control, he confessed. And tonight, I am not sure if I am more man or monster. Sleep was impossible. Eira lay on her narrow cot in the back room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl. But even the storm couldn't drown out the sound of Kaelen's breathing in the main room. Ragged, heavy, and pained. She closed her eyes, and all she could see was the gold in his gaze when he had pinned her to the table. The hunger. The terrifying promise of mine. Crash. The sound wasn't the wind. It was the front door exploding inward, splinters of wood flying like shrapnel across the cabin. Eira screamed, scrambling off her cot. In the main room, chaos had already erupted. The cold night air rushed in, carrying snow and men, 6 of them, heavily armed, wearing the dark leather of mercenaries. And in the center of the whirlwind was Kaelen. He moved like a blur of shadow. Despite his injury, despite the poison, he was a king fighting for his life. He caught the first man by the throat. The audible snap of bone cutting through the shouting. He threw the body into the second attacker, sending them both crashing into the shelves. Stay back, Eira! He roared, ducking under a swinging axe. He was magnificent and terrifying. He fought with a brutality that was entirely efficient, ripping weapons from hands and breaking limbs. But he was slowing down. Eira saw it. The slight stumble as his bad leg gave way, the sheen of sweat that wasn't from exertion, but from the return of the fever. Bring him down! Sheriff Duncan's voice bellowed from the doorway. He stood safely outside, a heavy crossbow raised. A mercenary swung a heavy iron chain. It struck Kaelen across the chest. The hiss of searing flesh filled the room. Kaelen shouted in agony, the iron burning his skin on contact. He staggered back, dropping to one knee. No! Eira grabbed her knife and ran forward. She didn't know what she planned to do. She just knew she couldn't watch him fall. She slashed at the nearest man, cutting his arm. He backhanded her with a gauntleted fist. The force of the blow sent her flying. Her head cracked against the stone hearth. Stars exploded in her vision, and the world tilted sideways. She slumped to the floor, dazed, tasting blood. "Eira!" Kaelen's roar shook the walls. He surged up, his eyes glowing so bright they illuminated the room. He was going to shift. He was going to tear them all apart, regardless of the iron, regardless of his heart stopping. "Don't move, beast!" Duncan stepped over the threshold. He wasn't aiming the crossbow at Kaelen. He was aiming it at Eira's head. Kaelen froze. The transformation halted, his body trembling violently with the effort to stop the change. He looked at Eira, prone on the floor, blood trickling from her temple. Then he looked at the bolt aimed between her eyes. "Drop it," Duncan ordered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Surrender, or the little witch dies right now." Silence fell over the ruined cabin. The wind whistled through the broken door. Kaelen looked at Eira. The gold in his eyes swirled with a grief so profound it stole the air from her lungs. He couldn't save her if he fought. He could only save her if he submitted. Slowly, agonizingly, Kaelen raised his hands. "Don't touch her," he growled, a sound that made the mercenaries flinch. "I will come, just don't touch her." "Smart dog," Duncan sneered. Two men rushed forward with iron manacles. They clamped them onto Kaelen's wrists. Smoke rose from his skin, but he didn't make a sound. He just stared at Eira, memorizing her face. "Take him to the sled," Duncan commanded. "Torvin is waiting." They dragged him out. He was too heavy to lift, so they hauled him like a carcass into the snow. Kaelen didn't fight. He kept his eyes on Eira until the doorframe cut off his view. Duncan lingered for a moment. He looked down at Eira, who was struggling to push herself up, her vision swimming. "What about the girl?" a mercenary asked. Duncan kicked a log from the fireplace onto the pile of furs. Then he kicked another onto the spilled oil from the lamp. Flames licked up instantly, hungry and fast. "Let the winter take her," Duncan said coldly. "Or the fire." He walked out. Eira lay on the floor, her head pounding, watching the fire spread to the curtains. The heat rose. The smoke began to pool against the ceiling. She was alone, and the king was gone. The smoke tasted like ash and lost memories. Eira coughed, a violent spasm that rattled her skull. The heat was unbearable. Flames were already licking up the walls, consuming the drying herbs, the rabbit pelts, the simple life she had built to hide from the world. "Get up!" a voice screamed in her head. "Or burn!" She rolled onto her stomach, the movement sending a spike of agony through her temple where she'd hit the hearth. The air near the floor was clearer. She crawled, her fingers digging into the rough wood, dragging herself toward the broken door. The roof groaned above her. A beam snapped, showering sparks. Eira lunged forward, throwing herself out into the snow just as the main beam came crashing down behind her. The cabin, her sanctuary, collapsed in a roar of fire and timber. She lay face down in the snow, gasping for clean, freezing air. The cold pressed against her skin, but for the first time in her life, it didn't bite. It felt welcoming, like a cool hand soothing a fever. She rolled over and watched the flames dance against the black sky. She had lost everything, her home, her supplies, her anonymity. But as she stared into the fire, she didn't feel grief. She felt a cold, hard rage solidifying in her gut, and she felt him. It wasn't a sound or a scent. It was a phantom pain in her wrists, echoing the manacles they had put on him. It was a dull ache in her chest. a hollow space where a heartbeat should be. The bond. Kaelen had called it biology, fate. She had called it magic. But now, with the tether pulling at her soul, stretching north into the dark, she knew it was real. He was out there. He was in pain. And he was waiting for her. Eira stood up. She swayed, dizzy, but the wind steadied her. She looked down at her hands. They were raw, covered in soot and blood, but they weren't shaking anymore. "You missed one thing, Duncan," she whispered to the empty clearing. She walked to the edge of the ruin, to the small, stone-lined pit she used for cold storage outside the cabin. It was buried under snow, untouched by the fire. She dug frantically. Her fingers brushed leather. She pulled out her satchel, the emergency kit she kept for deep winter calls. Inside, a flask of high-proof spirits, a roll of clean bandages, a skinning knife, and 3 small vials of wolfsbane concentrate. She held the purple glass to the firelight. It was poison to wolves. A single drop could paralyze a shifter. A dose could kill a king. She tucked the vials into her belt. She wasn't a warrior. She couldn't fight mercenaries with a sword. But she was a healer. She knew exactly how to stop a heart, and she knew exactly how to break a body. She turned her back on the burning wreckage of her life. The storm was raging, a whiteout blizzard that would have blinded any normal tracker. But as Eira stepped into the tree line, a strange thing happened. The wind didn't push her back. It seemed to flow around her, parting like a stream around a stone. The snow didn't sting her eyes. It settled softly on her lashes. Eira. The name meant snow. Her mother had named her that before abandoning her at the orphanage. She had always hated the cold, always fought against it. But now, she realized the cold wasn't her enemy. It was her blood. She closed her eyes and reached out with her senses. She didn't smell the tracks like a wolf. She felt the disturbance in the winter air. She felt the heat of the sled moving away. She opened her eyes. The path was clear to her, a faint silver line cutting through the dark. She began to run. She didn't run with the speed of a shifter, but she ran with the relentless endurance of a blizzard. She moved through the drifts, silent as a ghost, the white cloak she had grabbed from the satchel blending perfectly with the landscape. Miles ahead, the convoy would be slow. They were dragging a heavy sled. They were arrogant. They thought she was dead. They had no idea that the winter itself was coming for them. 2 hours later, Eira crested the ridge overlooking the Black Canyon. Below, the flicker of torches cut through the gloom. Duncan and his men had stopped. The terrain was too rough for the sled to cross the ravine in the dark. They were camped on the near side, waiting for dawn or for Torvin's escort to meet them. Eira crouched behind a snow-covered boulder, looking down. There were 6 men. They were drinking, laughing, huddled around a large fire. And there, chained to a rock away from the warmth, was Kaelen. He was on his knees in the snow, stripped to the waist. His head hung low, his black hair hiding his face. The iron manacles had burned his wrists raw. He wasn't moving. The cold should have killed him by now in his weakened state. But he was fighting. Eira could feel it, a stubborn, flickering ember of life in her own chest. She uncorked the flask of spirits. She took a rag from her bag and soaked it. Then she took one of the vials of wolfsbane. She didn't need to be stronger than them. She just needed to be smarter. Eira looked at the wind direction. It was blowing directly into their camp. She crept down the ridge, moving not like a woman, but like a shadow. She wasn't Eira the healer anymore. She was the Alpha's mate, and she was about to show them why the king had chosen her. The camp smelled of cheap ale and overconfidence. Eira moved through the shadows of the tree line, her white cloak making her invisible against the snowdrifts. The wind was her ally, blowing her scent away from the guard posting near the horses. She crept closer. Her heart wasn't racing anymore. It was beating with a cold, steady rhythm. Thump, thump, kill. She reached the perimeter. The nearest mercenary was leaning against a tree, his back to her, watching the fire instead of the forest. Eira didn't hesitate. She stepped out of the shadow. She didn't have the strength to snap a neck, but she knew exactly where the carotid artery lay. She pressed the hilt of her knife hard into the pressure point at the base of his skull. He crumbled without a sound. Eira stepped over him, moving deeper into the circle of light. She saw Kaelen clearly now. He was slumped against the rock, his skin blue-white from the cold. The iron cuffs had eaten into his wrists, trails of black blood frozen on his forearms. He wasn't moving. A surge of panic threatened to break her focus, but she shoved it down. She needed a distraction. She uncorked the flask of high-proof spirits. She ripped a strip of cloth from her hem, stuffed it into the bottleneck, and soaked it. She looked at the cluster of men by the fire. Duncan was there, laughing, a key set dangling from his belt. Eira lit the rag with her flint. She counted to 3. She threw the flask. It sailed through the air and smashed into the roaring campfire. Whoosh! The explosion was blinding. A fireball erupted, spraying burning alcohol and embers over the men. They screamed, scrambling back, batting at their singed clothes. The horses reared and shrieked, tearing at their tethers. Chaos. Eira sprinted. She didn't run away. She ran straight into the center of the madness. She reached Kaelen, skidding to her knees in the snow beside him. Kaelen! His head snapped up. His eyes were dull, the gold faded to a muddy brown. He looked at her as if she were a hallucination. Eira. His voice was a broken whisper. Run. Not without you. She grabbed his face, her hands warm against his freezing skin. The contact was electric. She felt a jolt go through him, a spark of life jumping from her soul to his. His eyes widened, the gold flaring brighter. The chains! She gasped. I need to get them off. The key! Kaelen rasped, nodding toward the fire. Duncan! Eira turned. The sheriff had recovered from the blast. He was standing 10 yards away, his face soot-stained, his eyes wide with rage. He saw Eira kneeling by the prisoner. You! Duncan roared, drawing his sword. I should have burned you alive! He charged. Kaelen roared, straining against the chains, but he was too weak to break the iron. Eira, move! Eira didn't move. She stood up. She reached into her belt and pulled out the vial of wolfsbane concentrate. She uncorked it with her thumb. Duncan was fast for a big man. He closed the distance, raising the sword to cleave her in two. Eira waited. She waited until she could smell his sour sweat. She waited until the blade began its downward arc. Then she sidestepped, a movement born of desperation and the strange, heightened instinct of the bond. She threw the liquid into his face. Duncan screamed. The wolfsbane burned like acid in his eyes, blinding him instantly. He swung the sword wildly, missing her by an inch. He stumbled, clutching his face, dropping to his knees. Eira didn't stop. She lunged forward, grabbing the keys from his belt. She scrambled back to Kaelen. Her hands shook as she jammed the key into the lock of the wrist cuffs. Click. The iron fell away. Kaelen slumped forward, his arms free, but he didn't stand. He fell into her, his weight crushing her into the snow. He was shivering violently, his body shutting down from the prolonged exposure to the iron. "Kaelen!" Eira cried, shaking him. "Get up! We have to go!" "Can't," he wheezed, his head lolling against her chest. "Too cold. Need blood." Eira froze. She looked at the mercenaries recovering from the fire. They were drawing weapons. They were coming. She looked at Kaelen. He was dying. The iron had drained him of the energy needed to heal. He needed fuel. A lot of it. Immediately. She remembered the legends. The way a mate strengthened an alpha. "Take it," she whispered. She pulled the collar of her tunic down, exposing her neck to the biting wind. Kaelen's eyes fluttered open. He smelled the pulse beating frantically beneath her skin. His pupils dilated, swallowing the iris. "No," he groaned, fighting the instinct. "I'll hurt you." "If you don't, we both die," Eira said fiercely. She grabbed his hair and pulled his face to her neck. "Take it, Kaelen. That is an order." The mercenaries were 5 yards away. Kaelen let out a guttural sound, half sob, half growl. His resistance shattered. He sank his teeth into the curve of her neck. It wasn't a gentle nip. It was a claim. Eira cried out, her back arching, but the pain was instantly washed away by a flood of euphoria so intense it buckled her knees. It wasn't just blood he was taking. It was power. She felt her energy pouring into him, and in return, his fire poured into her. The bond snapped into place. It was a physical sensation, like a golden chain welding their souls together. Kaelen released her. He stood up, and as he rose, the shadows around them seemed to lengthen. The air pressure dropped. The wind stopped howling. He turned to face the mercenaries. His wounds were gone. His skin was flushed with life, and his eyes were no longer just gold. They were burning with the white-hot fury of a god who had just been returned to his throne. He smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Eira had ever seen. "Run!" Kaelen whispered to the men. They didn't get the chance. The violence that followed was not a battle. It was an execution. Kaelen didn't shift fully into his wolf form. He didn't need to. He moved with a speed that blurred the edges of reality, a wraith of shadow and vengeance fueled by the ancient magic Eira had just poured into his veins. The first mercenary lunged with a spear. Kaelen caught the shaft mid-air, snapped the ashwood like a twig, and drove the jagged end back into the man's chest. He didn't stop to watch him fall. He was already moving to the second. Eira stood frozen in the snow, her hand pressed to the bleeding bite mark on her neck. She should have been horrified. She was a healer. Her life was dedicated to mending, not ending. But through the golden tether that now blazed between their souls, she didn't feel horror. She felt him. She felt the cool, predatory calculation in his mind. She felt the surge of satisfaction as his fist connected with a jawbone, shattering it. She felt the absolute, terrifying certainty that he was the apex of this world, and everyone else was merely prey. It was intoxicating. The mercenaries broke. They were hardened killers, but they were fighting a force of nature. Two turned to run, Stumbling through the deep snow, Kaelen let out a roar, a sound that was half man, half wolf, and wholly terrifying. Shadows seemed to stretch from his feet, chasing the fleeing men, tripping them, dragging them down into the dark. He was upon them in a heartbeat. There were screams, then silence. In less than a minute, only Sheriff Duncan remained. The blinded man was crawling on his hands and knees, clawing at the snow, whimpering. The wolfsbane was still burning his eyes, but the terror of the sounds around him was worse. Kaelen walked toward him. The snow melted beneath his boots. The air around him shimmered with heat. He stopped in front of the crawling sheriff. He reached down, gripping the back of Duncan's tunic, and hauled him to his knees. "Please," Duncan sobbed, blood and tears streaking his soot-stained face. "I was paid. It was Torvin. I was just following orders." "You aimed a crossbow at her head?" Kaelen said. His voice was calm, unnervingly calm. "You touched her face. You burned her home." "I'm sorry. I'll leave. You'll never see me again." Kaelen leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the clearing to where Eira stood. "You are right. You will never see anything again." Kaelen didn't kill him. Death was too easy. Instead, he leaned down and whispered a word of power, an alpha command that vibrated in the air like a gong. "Run!" It wasn't a suggestion. It was a compulsion. Duncan scrambled up, screaming as his body obeyed the order his mind couldn't resist. He ran. He ran blind, screaming into the pitch-black forest, straight toward the cliffs of the Black Canyon. Kaelen watched him go. He didn't wait for the scream to cut off. He turned around. The rage evaporated from his face the moment his eyes landed on Eira. He stood there, chest heaving, his hands stained with the violence he had wrought. He looked wild, ancient, and beautiful. Eira took a step toward him, then another. Then she was running. She collided with him, wrapping her arms around his blood-stained waist. He caught her, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in as if she were oxygen and he had been drowning for years. "You're safe," he rasped, his voice shaking. "I have you." "You stayed," Eira whispered into his chest. "You could have run when I released the chains. You stayed." Kaelen pulled back slightly, cupping her face with his large, warm hands. He looked at the mark on her neck, the bruising bite where he had claimed her essence. He ran his thumb over it, his expression tormented. "Run?" He let out a dark, incredulous laugh. "Eira, don't you understand what you did? You fed me your life. You bound us." He rested his forehead against hers. "I couldn't leave you if the world was ending. I am tethered to you. Every beat of my heart echoes yours." Eira looked up into his golden eyes. There was no confusion left in them, no fever, only a clarity that frightened and thrilled her. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means," Kaelen said, his gaze dropping to her lips, "that you are no longer just a healer from the woods. You are the mate of the High King. You are my queen. And God have mercy on anyone who tries to take you from me again." He didn't give her time to argue. He didn't give her time to think about the politics or the danger. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was the crash of tectonic plates. It was fire and ice colliding. It tasted of blood, adrenaline, and snow. Eira opened to him, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to her. The cold of the hinterlands vanished. The ruin of her cabin didn't matter. The threat of Torvin was a shadow for another day. Right here, in the blood-stained snow, under the indifferent stars, she had found the one thing she had never believed in. She had found where she belonged. Kaelen broke the kiss, breathless, his forehead resting against hers. "Let's go home, Eira." "I don't have a home," she reminded him softly. "You burned it down, remember?" "Well, your enemies did." Kaelen scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He looked north, toward the jagged peaks of the true mountains, where the aurora borealis was beginning to bleed green and violet across the sky. "No," he said, holding her tight against his heart. "We are going to my home, to the Winter Palace." He began to walk, carrying her through the snow, leaving the carnage behind them. "Torvin thinks he has taken my throne," Kaelen whispered into the wind, his voice hardening with a promise of war. "He thinks I died in the ice. He is going to learn that winter has teeth, and I am bringing the storm with me." The Winter Palace did not sit on the mountain. It was carved into it. Spires of black obsidian rose from the white peaks like jagged teeth, and the great halls were lit by chandeliers of enchanted ice that never melted. It was a fortress designed to withstand sieges, blizzards, and time itself. For Eira, it had taken some getting used to. She stood on the high balcony of the royal suite, the wind whipping the heavy velvet of her midnight blue gown. Below, the city of Frosthold sprawled out in concentric circles, glowing with the golden light of hearth fires. It was a stark contrast to the lonely, dark cabin in the Hinterlands where she had lived like a ghost for so long. "You're thinking too loud," a deep voice rumbled from the shadows behind her. Eira smiled, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She felt him. The bond between them had settled from the raging wildfire of that first night into a steady, unshakable hum, a constant awareness of his location, his mood, his very heartbeat, arms wrapped around her waist from behind, heavy and possessive. Kaelen pulled her back against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck, right over the faint silver scar where he had marked her. "I'm not thinking," Eira whispered, leaning into his warmth. "I'm remembering." "A dangerous pastime," Kaelen murmured, kissing the sensitive skin below her ear. "Remembering the cold?" "Remembering the silence," she corrected. "I spent 5 years talking to no one but injured foxes and my own reflection. Now," she gestured to the ballroom doors behind them, where the muffled sound of music and laughter drifted through. "Now I have an entire court waiting for me to nod so they can breathe." Kaelen chuckled, the sound vibrating through her spine. "They don't wait for your nod, agra. They wait for your mercy. You terrified Lord Vane today." "Lord Vane suggested we cut the grain rations to the outer villages," Eira said, her voice sharpening slightly. "I told him if he wanted to starve the people, he should start by skipping his own 7-course dinners. And that," Kaelen said, turning her in his arms so he could look down at her, "is why they love you, and why Vane is currently terrified you'll poison his wine." Eira looked up at him. 6 months had changed him too. The gaunt, wounded wolf she had dragged off the ice was gone. In his place stood the High King of the North in his full glory. He wore a tunic of black silk embroidered with silver thread, and a heavy fur cloak rested on his shoulders. The crown of jagged iron sat on his brow, but it was the look in his eyes that held the true power. The gold was bright, clear, and focused entirely on her. The war for the throne had been short and brutal. When Kaelen had returned to Frosthold, walking out of the blizzard with Eira at his side, the usurper Torvin hadn't stood a chance. The sight of the dead king, fully healed and radiating the power of a completed bond, had shattered the loyalty of Torvin's mercenaries instantly. Torvin had fled, but the winter had caught him. The cold, as Eira knew, always took what was owed. "Are you happy?" Kaelen asked suddenly, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. The question was serious. He asked it often, as if he still couldn't believe she had chosen to stay in this world of politics and blades. Eira reached up, tangling her fingers in the hair at the nape of his neck. "I am. Even with the court vipers? Even with the cold?" "The cold doesn't bother me anymore," she said softly. "And as for the vipers, I know how to handle snakes. I'm a healer, remember? I know the antidote to every poison." Kaelin's expression softened, a look of raw adoration that he saved only for her, only for these private moments in the dark. "You healed more than just my leg, Eira," he whispered. "You healed this kingdom. You healed me." He had been a hard king before, ruthless, distant, frozen. The frozen king, they had called him. But Eira had thawed him. She had brought compassion back to the throne. She had turned a reign of fear into a reign of respect. "We have guests waiting," Eira reminded him, though she made no move to leave his arms. "The delegation from the southern packs. They want to see the new queen." "Let them wait," Kaelen growled, his grip tightening. "I'm not done looking at her yet." He kissed her then, deep and slow. It wasn't the desperate life-or-death kiss of the snowstorm. It was a kiss of ownership, of peace, of a promise kept. It tasted of spiced wine and forever. When they broke apart, Eira was breathless, her cheeks flushed. "My king," she breathed. "My mate," he corrected. "My queen, my life." He stepped back, offering her his arm. The gesture was courtly, but the look in his eyes was pure, primal alpha. "Shall we go inside?" he asked. "I believe there is a throne next to mine that looks empty without you." Eira took his arm. She smoothed the skirt of her gown, lifted her chin, and felt the bond flare bright and hot in her chest. She wasn't the outcast girl on the ice anymore. She wasn't the victim of the village whispers. She was Eira of the Hinterlands, the woman who had walked into the storm to save a monster and found a king instead. "Yes," she said, smiling as the doors opened and the music swelled to greet them. "Let's go rule." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the mountains in white silence. But inside the palace, the hearths roared, and the ice chandeliers sparkled, reflecting the light of a kingdom that had finally found its heart. And the frozen king was frozen no more.